Today we're going to take a look at how we can hit the tennis ball as hard as possible with the best technique possible. So if we're trying to understand how we create pace with a tennis ball, we first have to look at the human body kind of like a whip. We're trying to create, a whipping effect that makes the racket go as fast as humanly possible in this moment. Obviously with as much control as possible as well, but if we're just taking a look at the speed, we have to think about how we get the end of the whip, which is the racket again, as fast as possible. If we're taking a look at that, we see that obviously we could just swing our wrist and make the racket decently fast. But what are the determining factors in how to make that whip even faster? Those are two things. First of all, the length of the whip, and second of all, the speed that you use to swing the whip. So if we're transferring that onto the human body, what is the length of the whip? The length of the whip would be how far is the handlebar of the whip away from the tip of the whip, right? The tip is our racket. The handlebar would be the part of the body that's the furthest away from the grip that can create power or has an influence on the swinging speed, right? So in this case, if we're taking a look at this, we can see if I straighten out my arm all the way, the furthest part away from my racket that could possibly have an influence on how fast the racket swings is my left shoulder. So that would be the handlebar. We have to start our motion with our left shoulder to make the whip as long as possible. Now, obviously, if we keep our arm completely straight and we just go like this, right? Yes, I'm using my left shoulder to create power, but I'm not creating power efficiently because I don't use that elasticity of the whip to create more force. Right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we have a kinetic change starting from the left shoulder, moving all the way across to the racket. So what that means is that our left shoulder has to be the first factor that's moving in trying to create rotation. And then from there, the next part that's moving is obviously my right shoulder because these two are connected, right? And if I start moving my left shoulder, eventually my right shoulder will start moving after the chest, obviously, because this is again connected. So when the right shoulder starts moving, my arm can still stay back here, right? Because of that elasticity, that flexibility that my arm has. So now the next part that would be moving is my upper arm, then my forearm, and then my wrist, which is the last part of the kinetic chain that is, connected to that hard part in the end of the whip, that is the racket. So that means we have to go from here to here to here to here to here. That's the order that things have to move in. If two of these parts move at the same time, we don't have that whipping effect. We don't get the most efficient and fastest way of movement here. So now, after taking a look at all that length, obviously the next determining factor is how fast do we rotate and how much flexibility do we have so we can store more tension, which then develops into that wrist flick that we're all looking for, or that whipping effect on the tennis ball. So in order to create as much power as possible, again, we need to make sure that we make the whip as long as possible. So in this case, if you want a lot of power, your arm should be straight, right? If you have your arm tucked in a little bit like this, you have less power because your whip is now shorter, thus it can't create as much energy and it won't hurt the ball as much. It won't swing as fast. So the straighter the arm, the more power we'll have, as long as everything works in the correct order and the shoulder rotation swings as fast as possible, allowing the arm to follow. So if you're trying to create as much power as possible, take a look at all these pieces and see what you're already doing and what you're not doing. For example, you could be hitting the ball too soft because you're doing everything correctly, but the wrist is the first part that moves. You're still moving everything else, everything is involved in the movement, but because the wrist is the first thing that moves, and then you're turning everything else, you don't create that whipping effect and you don't create enough power. So you need to make sure that you start your motion over here, right? Do you see the correct order from here to here to here to here to here? That's great. Now you already know that you have the right order so you can create a lot of power. Then, is your arm as straight as you possibly could get it? No? Well, that means you're probably losing some power there as well. And then lastly, how fast do you rotate? Do you feel like you could rotate your upper body quicker? Well, that's where you're losing power as well. Now, one thing that's super important to keep in mind is if you're trying to create a lot of power, you still have to have enough control in your wrist and enough strength in your wrist to make sure that the racket doesn't move like this at the end of the whip. Because then, yes, you have the power still, but you're losing control over your shot. So the more or the longer the whip is, the more power you can create, but also the more strength you need in your grip and in your wrist to make sure that you control that motion so your contact point is correct. Because keep in mind, the harder you hit, the more of an effect a slight deviation in angle of your racket during the contact point has on the ball. For example, if I hit the ball very soft and I hit the ball like this, or I hit the ball like this, the distance the ball is going to cover is not going to make a big difference. But if I hit really hard and I touch the one ball like this and one ball like this, you probably have a difference of 3 to 6 feet in the distance that you're hitting. And that's a problem because now you have to be very accurate. The harder you hit, the more accurate you have to be with your wrist angle, with your racket angle, and thus the more strength and experience and repetitions you have to make in order to create the correct wrist angle every single time, even if you hit that hard. So don't try to just hit hard without having enough experience and control in your wrist to control the ball. Thus, you want to do that mostly in practice for the beginning, get used to all that extra power, learn how to control it, and then start using in matches. So don't just look for extra power for no reason if you can't even control the power you currently have, right? But as long as you can control your power, try to implement some of these extra things that we just talked about to make sure that you can gain a little bit more power with less effort because you're involving more of your body in the motion, and thus you can relax a little bit more, go for longer rallies without tiring out, and as long as you still have the wrist control to control the shot, it'll make your game much easier.
And now, as usual, we have a quick example for you guys, in this case Nadal, and he's preparing for the shot here. So obviously the first thing that has to happen is for him to set up his feet and find his balance, which he's working on right now while he is trying to complete the backswing in a most efficient manner. Now the racket moves back here, and we can see as soon as the racket starts dropping and his feet are set up, he will start to rotate his upper body, which is a rotation that in his case, because he's left-handed, starts in the right shoulder right here, which then, because it's connected, creates that rotation in the left shoulder, the upper arm, the forearm, and the wrist, snapping through the ball right here. And as you can see, his arm is almost completely straight, which creates the longest whip possible. And obviously, if he hits hard in comparison to most of us, he uses a lot of fast rotation. He's very explosive in his shoulders, which helps him to create the most efficient whip that he possibly could.
Hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys soon.